Robot Master to start with. I remembered hearing years ago that Cutman, Fireman, and Bomb Man were ideal choices. The first stage I went into was Bomb Man's, and once I'm making my way through it, it's pretty easy to see why it's considered a good first level. Most of it is just learning where to stand, so you can move through the gaps in enemy attacks. Because of that, it makes very little difference what powers you enter with, since the stage is more about avoiding the enemies instead of fighting them. When you do need to get rid of something though, your basic buster attack is usually the best option anyway. When you reach Bomb Man himself, he has, in my opinion, one of the easiest patterns to deal with. You might think that you're supposed to keep your distance and then move under these bomb tosses, but it's actually a lot simpler than that. Whenever you're close to him, he'll jump away, so as long as you're always moving towards him, you can easily land shots while he hops around. He'll barely even get the chance to attack you. With the first Robot Master defeated, you can finally start using more than just the Mega Buster for attacks. Bomb Man's ability is the Hyper Bomb. With it, you can toss out a bomb. And from here, I can finally start talking about the weakness order of the game. In Mega Man, every boss will take damage from your normal attack, but there's always one ability that they'll take massive damage from. Gutsman is the one who's weak to the Hyper Bomb. Defeating him unlocks the Super Arm, which lets you pick up and throw blocks. Throwing blocks with the Super Arm is the weakness of Cutman, and defeating Cutman gets you the Rolling Cutter, which is really effective against Electman. Electman's power is the Thunder Beam, which will destroy Iceman in just a few seconds. Beating Iceman gets you the Ice Slasher, which deals good damage to Fireman. And finally, getting past Fireman unlocks the Firestorm, which is the weakness of Bomb Man. It should be noted that the effectiveness of all of these abilities isn't actually told to the player in-game. Of course, nowadays, you can always just look up this stuff on the internet if you really want to, but I think the intention here is to reward you for experimenting. Some bosses could be a bit difficult if you didn't have the right weapon, but they weren't by any means impossible. Destroying a boss with their weakness was more of a bonus than an absolute necessity. So now that I've explained that, the next thing I want to highlight is how all of these abilities can affect how you handle the regular enemies in this game. Mega Man's mechanics go far beyond the walls of the boss rooms, and I found that I surprisingly have a lot to say. Take this enemy here, for example. It appears in multiple areas, and you can't destroy it with the Mega Buster. Only freeze it in place for a few seconds, making it easier to jump around. However, most of the other weapons in the game will get rid of it completely. In Gutsman stage, there is one portion where these mining robots will attack you. They normally take several shots from the Buster, but if you use the Hyper Bomb, they'll go down in one hit. This makes the most sense since this is also Gutsman's weakness, but these enemies are also weak to the Firestorm. So even if you haven't beaten Bomb Man yet, if you've got Fireman's power, you still technically have an advantage when you're going through here. Another enemy you'll see frequently is this hopping robot. Technically, it takes the most damage from the Super Arm blocks and the Hyper Bomb, but it has so much HP that you might as well just try to avoid it altogether. Its jumping is random, but if you happen to have the Ice Slasher, you can freeze it in the air and move under it pretty safely. In addition to that, in Fireman's area, you can briefly freeze the Pillars of Fire and use them as platforms. Cutman's entire stage is filled with blocks, so if you cleared Gutsman already, you have some more options for moving through it. Having gone through the game several times while making this video, it felt like I was learning something new about the enemies every playthrough. However, I do have to point out one major mistake they made with one enemy. This robot right here is known as a Sniper Joe. You might recognize it, as it would go on to become a pretty iconic enemy in the franchise, appearing frequently in later games. But in the case of Mega Man 1, Sniper Joes only show up in one tiny section at the end of Bomb Man stage, and their weakness is the Hyper Bomb. I think you can see what the problem is. By the time you have Joe's weakness, you'll never see them again for the rest of the game. It is possible to replay the stages, but there's no reason to ever go back to this area. And normally you have to play patiently with this enemy, since it'll try to chase you if you jump past it. So you're stuck waiting until its shield is down to attack. The Hyper Bomb destroys them in one hit, but it's completely worthless with how the game is set up. Maybe it's possible the devs intended to use Joes in other stages, but the end result is what we got here. I think it's a pretty big shame, too, since the Hyper Bomb isn't exactly the most useful ability. Aside from using it against Gutsman, I find myself never using it again. It's just too slow. You can only hit things on the ground. With all that being said, though, I don't think there is any question that Electman's ability is the best in the game. In fact, I'd almost say that it's too good. The Thunder Beam fires a blast above, below, and in front of you. As well, since it can go through walls and floors, this makes it easy to clear out enemies with. And as if that wasn't enough, it can even destroy the Super Arm blocks too. As much as I love how the game encourages you to use all of the weapons, once you get this one, you'll end up using it the majority of the time. The biggest exception to this is the bosses. Hitting them with their weakness is always going to be the strongest option. And while we're on the subject, I want to talk a little bit about the game's damage values. Going into Mega Man, I kind of assumed that every weapon did the same damage, and it was only the weakness that did a little bit more. However, that couldn't be further from the truth. Focusing on just the Robot Masters, the numbers I put on screen show how much damage each one takes from just the Mega Buster. As you can see, Cutman takes the most damage, while Iceman and Electman take the least. Now, if we look at how much damage they take from their weaknesses, you can see that the numbers increase by quite a bit. From this, you can probably see why certain Robot Masters are recommended for playing first. Cutman is clearly designed to be the easiest boss fight, and in the case of Fireman and Bombman, the additional damage from their weaknesses doesn't make as much of a difference as the others. As well, when trying out other weapons against the Robot Masters, you'll find that the damage values vary greatly. For example, despite the Thunder Beam being one of the best attacks in the game, for most of the bosses, it'll only deal a tiny bit of damage. For many of them, it'll do even less than the Mega Buster. The next thing I want to mention is how this game handles checkpoints and game overs. I think Mega Man is pretty forgiving when it comes to this stuff. Whenever I died, as long as I had remaining lives, it never felt like the game put me too far back from where I was. And even if you do get a game over, the only punishment is that you have to start the stage over from the beginning. You don't have to worry about replaying any of the stages you already cleared. You should be aware, though, that there are no saves, or even a password system. Pretty much expected to beat the whole thing in one sitting. However, if you're playing on something like the Legacy Collection, you can just use the built-in save state features to take a break, and turn it off whenever you want. I probably should say here that I have beaten the game without doing that, because that matters to some people. Something else that happens when you get a game over is that your score will be reset to 0. This really doesn't matter though. Points are easily the most unnecessary mechanic in the entire game. Even if you manage to stay alive from start to finish, it's impossible for any high scores to be competitive. When you select a Robot Master, the amount of points you'll earn by defeating them is
how long is
determined
this?
randomly.
What?
Not only that, but there isn't any kind of time limit when you're playing. If you really want to earn points, there's nothing stopping you from just infinitely farming the enemies. Fortunately, starting with Mega Man 2, they abandoned this idea
6
altogether.
minutes.
Considering
Jesus
the time that
Christ.
the first game was released, it wouldn't surprise me if the score system was some kind of executive mandate.
Yeah,
It
someone
feels like
skipped,
it's only here
actually.
just because lots of other games had it. So moving
So
along,
someone-
it's now
someone
time
skipped.
to talk about